Former president found guilty of 34 felony counts.
Donald Trump, the first U.S. president tried in a criminal court, falsified business records to suppress potentially damaging information ahead of his 2016 election.
Plus, Biden relents and allows Kyiv to use American-made weapons to counter Russian attacks in the Kharkiv region bordering Russia.
Ukraine has an Article 51 obligation and right under the UN Charter to defend itself against this aggression.
And later, we talk with a criminal defense lawyer about the Trump verdict, a look at Ukrainian children abducted by Russia, and now that voting is finished in South Africa, what's next? Today is Friday, May 31st, and this is VOA's Flashpoint Global Crises. Good evening, I'm Steve Karish in Washington. For the first time in American history, a former president has been convicted of a felony offense. Tina Trin reports from New York.
Guilty on all 34 counts. That's what a unanimous New York jury decided after less than 2 days of deliberation. That Donald Trump, the first U.S. president tried in a criminal court, falsified business records to suppress potentially damaging information ahead of his 2016 election. After hearing the verdict, the presumed 2024 Republican presidential candidate left the courthouse, saying voters will decide his fate on Election Day.
This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people.
But those voters may not include Trump himself, says University of Virginia professor Barbara Perry.
It would be the case that if he maintains his residency in Florida, a state where convicted felons are not allowed to vote, that he literally would not be allowed to vote for himself.
President Joe Biden's re-election campaign released a statement saying, "In New York today, we saw that no one is above the law." Former federal prosecutor and New York Law School professor Steve Cohen was not surprised by the verdict.
The legal reality is either you believe in the jury system or you don't. And I happen to believe in the jury system. The case was tried. It was tried carefully, at times almost meticulously. It doesn't mean there won't be issues on appeal. There always are issues on appeal. It doesn't mean that there won't be surprises to come.
22 witnesses testified in the 6-week trial, including a tabloid newspaper editor who described suppressing stories critical of Trump. Adult film star Stormy Daniels, who said she was paid to keep quiet about a sexual encounter with Trump that he denies. And former Trump attorney Michael Cohen, who said he made those payments to Daniels on Trump's behalf. Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg said the jury made its decision based on the evidence in the law.
While this defendant may be unlike any other in American history, we arrived at this trial and ultimately today at this verdict in the same manner as every other case that comes through the courtroom doors, by following the facts and the law, and doing so without fear or favor.
Trump's sentencing is scheduled for July 11th, just days before the Republican Party is expected to formally nominate him as its presidential candidate at a party convention in the Midwestern state of Wisconsin. Tina Trin, VOA News, New York.
And for a closer look at the verdict and its historic nature, my colleague Lori London spoke with Jack Rice. He's a criminal defense attorney and a former CIA officer.
To call this historic doesn't even do it justice. We've been hearing this word over and over, but this is actually something else. To actually see a former president of the United States convicted of not just one, but 34 felonies is really quite astounding. And frankly, for those who are simply looking at the criminal justice system, there is this question of whether or not the system is fair. Now, for some, maybe it's just the people who wanted him convicted. I think the real question becomes, is there anybody above the law? And I think today they would say the answer is no. In fact, even a former president can be convicted of a crime. We've never seen anything like this in the past. So this is a really amazing day when it comes to what that means. For those who are saying that this was all, as the former president just said, this is a shambles, that this was all a setup. This was part of the legal witch hunt. You're going to see that crowd continuing to voice that opinion too. So you have both sides. You're seeing sort of tearing apart of the country in a sense, that schism that we have seen over the last 8 years and then some, really starting to highlight itself in the wake of these decisions.
If you were to round up what these guilty charges mean, these 34 charges basically say?
A jury of 12 determined that former President Trump, when he was running for office, essentially falsified business documents. And there were 34 counts separately against him. But what this was really about was not just the documents themselves, it was why it was done. So it was a combination of the documents themselves, but if you actually add what this was about the election, if you will, too. So that was both sides of that. But again, I think what makes it so dramatic is that this wasn't just one count of 34. This was every single count where this jury came back unanimously. And you can understand just how dramatic, how amazing, frankly, historic, we come back to that word, that we have, that you have a jury of 12 people, just everyday, normal, average Americans who are sitting in judgment, which they do every day across the country for defendants, to actually have a former president in the box, essentially the defendant in this case, and then having them judge him. That is part of what makes this so astounding, because this doesn't happen in most places in the world. And frankly, this has never happened in the United States before. And so when you see that, it really does show an extraordinarily unique system that doesn't happen every day and certainly doesn't happen in large swaths of the world.
That's VOA's Lori London speaking with criminal defense attorney Jack Rice. And now to the war in Ukraine. Ukrainian officials say Russia's invasion has turned thousands of Ukrainian children trapped in occupied territories into hostages, while others have been deported to Russia and forced into re-education programs and adoption. Our correspondent Anna Chernikova reports from Kyiv.
As of May 2024, the Ukrainian government has identified more than 19,000 children who have been deported or forcibly displaced by Russia. Fewer than 400 of them have been found and returned home. Mykola Kuleba, a founder of the Save Ukraine charity organization that helps to find and return Ukrainian children, says he believes the actual numbers is much higher if one takes into account the Russian occupation of Crimea and Donbas in 2014. He says there are many more such children. We're communicating this figure, which is for the last 2 years. And the war has been going on for 10 years. Bogdan Shvetsov from Kherson is 14 years old. When Russian forces overran the city, the headmaster of his school, appointed by the Russian occupation, proposed he join a 2-week trip to a children's camp in Crimea. Bogdan agreed, as did many other children. Bogdan recalls that when the 2 weeks had passed, camp representatives told the children they would not go home yet, due to security concerns. Shvetsov recalls they said, "For your safety we will leave you in the camp. You will be safe here, because there will be shelling in your region." And they said they had nowhere to take us. Bogdan's mother, Irina Shvetsova, says the teacher who was accompanying the children told her the only way she would see her son again was if she traveled to Crimea to pick him up there. Irina recalls the headmaster of this camp said they had given a deadline of April 7th, and those who do not pick up the children, those children who have parents, the children will be distributed to different places. Shvetsova describes the 6 months she spent waiting as a time of horror. I didn't sleep at all, she says. I constantly had the thought in my head, what should I do now? What should I do next? Irina found volunteers who were helping parents return children like Bogdan back to the territories that Ukraine controlled. Shvetsova says 33 children were returned on April 7th. There were supposed to be 33, she said, but only 32 came back, because there were 2 sisters and one of them stayed in Crimea. Their grandmother, who was going to pick up her granddaughters, died on the way while being interrogated by the Russians. The International Criminal Court has charged Russian President Vladimir Putin with the war crimes for the unlawful deportation and transfer of children. Ukrainian officials say thousands of its children are held illegally in Russia or on Russian-occupied territories away from their families, who fear many of them may never return. Anna Chernikova, VOA News, Kyiv.
You're listening to Flashpoint Global Crises from the Voice of America. I'm Steve Karish in Washington. We'll catch up with the Secretary of Defense in a bit, but first it's back to Kyiv and back to Anna Chernikova with a developing story. It looks like Ukraine is getting one of its key requests.
Following weeks of lobbying from Kyiv, the US and Germany have allowed Ukraine to use weapons they supplied to strike targets inside Russia to protect the Kharkiv region. Germany made such an announcement on May 31st. The statement came a day after reports that the United States had granted similar permission. Chancellor of Germany Olaf Scholz's spokesman said in a statement that Ukraine has the right to defend itself. US President Joe Biden also gave such permission. However, the BBC sources noted that the US ban on the use of military tactical missile systems, ATACMS, or longer-range strikes on Russian territory is still in effect. Germany and the US joined the group of Western countries that allow Kyiv to strike Russian targets with its weapons. In recent weeks, as Kyiv repelled a new offensive by Russian troops on the border of the Kharkiv region, the White House has come under pressure to allow Ukraine to use weapons to strike Russian territory. And while military leaders might be happy about the new flexibility they have in choosing targets, the Russian attacks are still coming. In the early hours of Friday, Russian forces launched a missile and drone attack targeting Kyiv, Zaporizhia, and Dnipropetrovsk regions. There were no deaths, but buildings were damaged in Kyiv from debris fall. The Russian forces also attacked Kharkiv with 5 missiles and hit a residential building. At least 6 people were confirmed killed and 30 injured there. Anna Chernikova, VOA News, Kyiv.
As we've heard, U.S. President Joe Biden has reversed course and is now allowing Ukraine to use American-made weapons against targets inside Russia. Ulia Armelenko reports for VOA's Ukrainian service. She spoke with Michael Carpenter. He's Senior Director for Europe at the U.S. National Security Council.
The United States is lifting a ban for Ukraine to use American weapons to strike at military targets across the border in Russia. Could you provide details about the shift in this policy? What is allowed and what are the limitations?
Sure. So this is in the context of the Russian offensive in the Kharkiv region against Ukraine. Russians were striking targets in Ukraine from just across the border. And at that point, the Ukrainians came to us with a request to use U.S.-provided weapons to be able to hit back at the Russian weapons that were targeting Ukrainian villages and Ukrainian people and their homes. And so the president directed his national security team to look into this and directed them to change the guidance and to allow for the employment of U.S.-provided weapons to be able to strike back. That guidance has now gone into effect. Again, this was at the direction of the president, and it was in the context of these weapon systems that were being fired across the border.
What influenced administration decision to make a shift in this policy?
So, as I said earlier, this is coming in the context of the Russian offensive in the Kharkiv region, where the Ukrainian side came to us and requested to be able to use American-provided weapons against Russian fires from the Russian side of the border. And the president immediately, as I said, directed his national security team to take this up.
You were in Ukraine not so long ago and you saw the situation firsthand. How does the administration, what is the hope of the administration on how this policy shift might influence Ukraine's position on a battlefield?
Well, we have all long wanted to give Ukraine the capabilities that it needs defensively to push back on this aggressive onslaught on their territory, and we will continue to do that.
There is a lot of criticism about Western support for Ukraine being rather reactive. So when something happens, it, if I may say, unlock some new capability. With this reverse in a policy, should we expect that now American support will be more proactive?
So, look, President Biden has led a coalition of more than 50 countries to unlock as many defensive capabilities for Ukraine as possible. The so-called Ramstein Group, or what is known formally as the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, is convened at President Biden's direction by the Secretary of Defense of the United States to find every capability that we could possibly surge to Ukraine to enable it to defend itself. Ukraine has an Article 51 obligation and right under the UN Charter to defend itself against this aggression. And we have spared no effort to provide, if I'm not mistaken now, over $81 billion of support to Ukraine since the start of this war, 51 billion of that being military support.
That's VOA's Ulia Armolenko speaking with Michael Carpenter, Senior Director for Europe at the U.S. National Security Council. Meanwhile, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin met with his Chinese counterpart in person for the first time on Friday on the sidelines of the annual IISS Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore. VOA's Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb has the details.
U.S. officials say Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin's talks with his Chinese counterpart aim to prevent tensions between the two nations from spiraling out of control, even as the United States remains committed to help regional allies counter Chinese aggression.
Of course, talks can make a difference. Having those mill-to-mill communications, those senior channels open, actually allows for the avoidance of a miscalculation.
The talks come a week after China launched 2 days of so-called punishment drills around Taiwan after the island swore in a new democratically elected leader.
The dragon in the neighborhood is starting to throw his tail around and breathe fire on folks, and we need to work with our allies to respond.
China has vowed to bring Taiwan under its control by force if necessary, while the U.S. supports maintaining the status quo. Beijing is also furious over Washington's deepening defense ties in the Asia-Pacific, particularly with the Philippines, where the U.S. has gained access to additional bases in an effort to bolster allies' defenses. Beijing unlawfully claims almost the entire South China Sea as its territory and places military assets on artificial islands to assert Chinese control. And analysts say China is learning from the United States' cooperation with allies in the region to advance its own goals.
We really see an axis of aggressors beginning to gel, to come together. We're seeing increased coordination and cooperation between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea.
The U.S., Japan, and South Korea say North Korea launched a ballistic missile into the sea on Thursday, amid Pyongyang's increasing cooperation with Russia and China. And a Defense Intelligence Agency report this week confirms Russia used North Korean ballistic missiles in its war against Ukraine. Carla Babb, VOA News, the Pentagon.
And now to Africa. On Friday, the African National Congress appeared poised to lose a parliamentary majority that it's had for 30 years, as South African voters punished the former liberation movement after years of national decline. Gabe Singer reports.
The African National Congress appears set to lose a parliamentary majority it has held for 30 years. By the early hours of Friday, its vote share stood at less than 43%, with half of all polling stations having reported results. The party of Nelson Mandela still looked likely to remain the largest political force, but for the first time in the country's post-apartheid history, it appears set to be pushed into a coalition with other parties. ANC chairperson Gwida Mantashe remained hopeful, however.
We are waiting for the results. We want to win with outright majority. A coalition is not a plan, it is a consequence. We'll deal with that consequence when it happens.
Which party the ANC might choose to work with remains unclear. The pro-business Democratic Alliance was in second place with over 23%, while the new party of former President Jacob Zuma was third at around 10%. Susan Boyson is a political analyst.
We're already pretty sure that the ANC is going to stabilize its support levels around 42% of the national vote. And that is quite a significant drop from about 57.5% in the elections, national elections 5 years ago. So that is a significant drop.
The last decade has seen the ANC racked by repeated corruption scandals. Meanwhile, South Africans have watched the economy stagnate, unemployment and poverty climb, and infrastructure crumble, leading to regular power outages. Under South Africa's proportional voting system, party shares of the vote determine the number of seats they get in the National Assembly, which then elects the next president. That could still be the ANC's leader and incumbent President Cyril Ramaphosa. However, an embarrassing showing at the polls could fuel a leadership challenge.
That's Gabe Singer of Reuters with that story. And finally today, Nigeria is currently experiencing its worst economic crisis in a generation. Some Nigerians are demanding a reversal of government policies a year after authorities embarked on bold but unpopular economic reforms. President Bola Tinubu has so far refused to change, insisting his reforms will improve Nigeria's ailing economy. Timothy Obiezu reports from Abuja.
This was how it all began on May 29, 2023, as Bola Tinubu was inaugurated as the 16th president of Africa's most populous nation. Under the campaign Renewed Hope, the so-called political godfather of Lagos promised economic growth, security, job creation, food security, and inclusive leadership. But 1 year later, many Nigerians who supported him, like trader Jolly Guinea Kanwa, say his approach is flawed.
That we are suffering. Tinubu should do something. Tinubu should do something. At least he's a human being. He's a human being. He's the one ruling this country. He did not come to destroy this country, but to take care of the people that is ruling. To take care of us. We are suffering. Children are crying. Adults are crying.
President Tinubu introduced controversial policies, including the scrapping of decades-long fuel subsidy payments and floating the naira against other world currencies shortly after taking office. Transportation and food prices have soared, leading to an annual inflation rate of 34%. Tinubu has assured Nigerians he'll fix inflation and address the economic challenges. This week, the president announced free train rides for 6 months as he opened a new metro station in Abuja to mark his first year in office. The president also announced the launch of several development projects, but critics say the government is irresponsible and pandering to foreign influence. Nigeria's security situation is also getting worse under Tinubu. According to Beacon Security Consulting Limited, the number of terrorist and criminal attacks in the last year increased to nearly 8,000 compared to 5,500 recorded the year before. Onyebere says lack of accountability is the reason the security problems have persisted.
Politics is still being trumping governance, especially in security. How many of these bandits have been captured, tried, prosecuted, and sentenced for people to see?
Nigerian workers' unions are threatening to protest if the president does not reverse his policies on fuel subsidies and the currency by the end of May. Many here say they will continue to remind the president of his campaign promises to make the country more secure and prosperous. Timothy Obiezu, VOA News, Abuja, Nigeria.
And that's going to wrap up today's show. There's more VOA coverage 24 hours a day on our website, voanews.com, and across our social media platforms. On behalf of everyone here at VOA, thanks for listening. Until next week, I'm Steve Karish.
For deeper dives and expert analysis, listen to VOA Podcasts. Issues in the News explores the biggest stories every weekend, while International Edition keeps you informed every weekday. Plus, with the 5-minute newscast at the top of every hour, you're always up to date.